And now we are going to our next speaker by Job, so that we already got a lot of story about Singapore and Hong Kong. How about if we look at different cities together? So Job will be tell us some story how to use different cities to look at about solar energy. Job.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I want to extend a special thanks to Dr. Ma and the Asian Energy Studies Center for inviting me here today to speak. So what I would be talking about today kind of goes into some additional details, some additional level of information following the keynote speaker this morning. What I thought I would talk about is this notion of the solar city concept, identifying the potential in a little bit more, with a little bit more technical information behind it, and then kind of go through how you could perhaps think about actually achieving this concept, right? Like, we talked this morning a little bit about Seoul setting targets to actually try and achieve this potential. And we're trying to basically kind of take that policy strategy and think about how other cities could perhaps replicate or mimic Seoul's achievements. So I basically have a kind of like a three-step process for my today's talk. Basically, I kind of want to go in a little bit of detail about what is the urban asset inventory, what is available in an urban environment that you could consider trying to tap into. Then talk a little bit about how would you do that on the conventional terms, conventional policy strategies, and perhaps how they might be adapted or modified to a level that is more in line with the size of the overall potential. And then a few slides about the actual direction that you could take or possible strategies that you could implement and achieve. So I work for the Foundation for Renewable Energy and Environment. A brief introduction of that was provided during the keynote speaker moment. But essentially, what we try to do is identify opportunities. Here I've listed four sectors that you could consider. But we are looking at additional ones also. So basically, if you talk about the urban environment, you could consider citywide potential for energy efficiency or renewable energy. We have a project on exterior and street lighting, so looking at the lighting within cities across the entire landscape of the city, or even what in our project we aggregated across many cities. Admittedly, the 35 municipalities that we looked into are surrounding a large city, so that by themselves they're not necessarily of a large scale, but 35 of them together makes a significant project. And then we have some projects that look into water and wastewater management and facilities that you can improve. But what I thought I would do today is kind of focus more on the renewable energy side. I do agree with the previous speaker that energy efficiency in urban environments is key and should be approached first, ideally also at a large city scale, right? You not at an individual household or project by project basis, but kind of like looking at the large environment of the city and identify strategies for deployment of energy efficiency. But so, like I said, what I'll try to do today is focus on renewable energy and go in a little bit more detail about the solar city concept. So what we did at the Foundation for Renewable Energy and Environment, we developed a three-stage process, three-stage module approach that tries to identify in the first stage what would be the potential of an urban environment to deploy solar energy at the city scale. So to do that, we look at building-based data, specifically LiDAR-based data. So for those who are not familiar, LiDAR is a way of remote sensing the urban environment. So you would, from an airplane or some remote sensor, map essentially the city in 3D. So you would build a 3D model of the city to get a sense of its spatial dimensions, which allow you then, if you incorporate that into your model, allow you to say something about the shading from building to building, for instance, or about the direction of the rooftops, or the obstructions that are on rooftops. So it's actually quite quite high resolution, so you could do it on a square meter basis. With the current LiDAR databases that are publicly available. Those are always improving, so there's actually opportunity to increase the resolution even further. But basically what we do, we take account of the shading patterns, the directions of the roof, and the space on the roof to say what would be technically feasible if you are not necessarily considering economics or policy, or even some additional technical dimensions, such as what could the grid handle, things like that, that could also be incorporated still. So you can then tell in a spatial temporal sense, so in a spatial sense for the buildings and in a generation sense over time, for each building in a city, what would be the potential, right? So the next module then talks about if you would want to pursue something like that at the scale that you have identified, what kind of market mechanisms work, what kind of pricing would you be able to achieve, and because it's kind of a new, innovative way of trying to develop a project, we considered a more of a stochastic overview of those dimensions, right? Like not fixed points, but saying there's a range for each point and trying to identify the range of financial feasibility of a project of that scale. And then finally, you could kind of consider, based on the outputs of Module 1 and Module 2, whether you would want to actually pursue this as a local government, and what kind of policies you have in your toolbox, and which ones might be useful and which ones could be used in different scenarios. So when you apply this model to different locations, we find that cities have a capability to produce roughly, as was indicated in the keynote speaker, roughly about 30% of their annual consumption with solar electricity, which is kind of graphically represented here, right? So it's a selection of cities across the world. And you see that roughly there's kind of like an average line between 30 or 40% of its annual consumption basis. And then the second major finding that kind of originates from this type of analysis is that significant potential is available, right? So what we've done here is we've scaled the size of the potential is the size of the bubble, essentially. So very large cities have large numbers of rooftops. New York City, for instance, has 1 million buildings, 1 million plus buildings, and as such has large amounts of space, right? So New York City is represented right here and can fit about a 10 gigawatt plant. Same roughly for Seoul and Mumbai and some other locations across the world. So what I thought I would do is kind of talk about one example. This morning we've heard some example about Seoul, and we have been investigating New York City in quite some detail as well. We've also looked at many other cities, including Tokyo, London, Munich, Amsterdam, and we've had some publications on those cities. So New York City is kind of an interesting example. One major reason is that New York City electricity prices are quite high, making it kind of an attractive location for alternative sustainable energy use. But additionally, New York City has an in-city fleet, so within city boundary generation fleet that is about, on average, over 40 years old, mostly natural gas. And there's two dimensions there that are relevant. One is that most of that natural gas production capacity serves Manhattan, and as such is located relatively closely to the city of Manhattan. Like, let me see, right, so this is Manhattan right here, and you have some very large generation facilities close by Manhattan, and they're typically located on the coastline. So this makes them relatively vulnerable. Hurricane Sandy, the experience was that a large portion of the power was knocked out by the hurricane because they are in the flood zones of New York. And then the second dimension, so there's a vulnerability dimension, and the second dimension is that these facilities primarily serve the peak moments of consumption. So the previous speaker talked about thermal comfort. The city's peak moments of consumption are also seasonal, are also in the summer. And these facilities primarily operate during those moments. In other moments of the year, power is imported into the city. So if you consider a solar city concept in that type of context, you can kind of match the potential output of a city's solar electricity generation, and you basically see that there's quite close alignment between the generation from solar and the actual peak consumption moment. So there's some potential value in focusing on solar there, other than some of the other things I'll show in the subsequent slides. So what we did is we looked at New York City in some detail, and here's just one representation of how you could visualize or could kind of group the data for the results of the analysis, right? So because you have a 3D model, you can kind of look at individual buildings, groups of buildings, jurisdictions of the city, districts, all that. And it allows you to kind of say something useful about the spatial and morphological dimensions of these buildings. So what we did here is just separate out flat roofs and slope roofs. Flat roofs typically are more attractive for solar installations, simply because it's relatively, compared to slope roofs, it's easy to actually install the systems. So when you do this by area of the city, so here are the 5 boroughs of New York City represented, you kind of see that there's about a 10 gigawatt total potential across the city, with various areas of the city having more space available than others. Most notably, you see that the city of Manhattan is relatively, compared to the other boroughs of the city, not as attractive to install solar. We find that about 430,000 installations would be possible if you're just considering the technical potential. So that's a very large number of, if you would look at them from an individual project by project basis, that would be quite a significant number of projects to operate. And we find that if you look at the potential system size, that there are about between 10 to 50 kilowatts. The majority of this 10 gigawatts is represented by systems that would be in the 10 to 50 kilowatt range. So if you kind of would look at this in a conventional way, right, if you would kind of consider these 430,000 potential installations as a project by project basis, you basically would try to align the supply of capital and of installers and developers with the demand for these systems by individual homeowners, for instance, or commercial developers, or project promoters, people that are operating programs that try to increase solar in the city. And you would develop policy tools like the FIT system that was mentioned before, the feed-in tariff, or in the United States, a popular tool is the tax breaks. You would basically try to make this overlap in between as large as possible, and then let the individual, like I said, homeowners or commercial owners decide whether they would want to install solar installation, right? That would be kind of like the conventional strategy to think about this. A previous speaker, Dr. Lepsan, I'm also not sure about the pronunciation, but mentioned that if you have these kinds of policy tools and you reach a level of scale, if you accelerate the market quickly, costs of support structures can kind of likewise accelerate very quickly, right? So there are some limitations built in to this type of approach. So that's why we kind of try and identify ways of considering a different level of strategy, right? So if you do it on a project by project basis, one advantage is that the market will kind of tell you what the overlap between supply and demand is and what associated price dimensions are relevant, right? So that's kind of like the typical conventional way of structuring the benefit of market mechanisms. The concern that we would have is A, it's going to take a while to develop 430,000 systems, and B, it might not be particularly reaching that level of skill that you would be interested in, right? So what we try to do, and what was kind of discussed also in the initial keynote opening, is achieve a level of, So achieve a level of aggregation, a level of increase where you start considering solar PV development within urban environments at the infrastructure scale, right? So it's not a project by project basis, but it's an infrastructure level, citywide strategy of community direction, right? So the concern there is then obviously, first the benefit, so at the benefit level, you would be able to reach that level of scale. You would perhaps be able to reach the level of speed that matches the actual challenge that we face. The concern would be obviously how are you going to effectively pay for a project like of that nature, right? Like what mechanism, what vehicle would you apply to actually make those payments, to make the initial investments for a citywide solar city, right? So the way we think about that challenge, the way we think about the mechanism, the vehicle that you could use, is where you realize that the conventional system that you're currently a part of comes at a cost already. You're already paying into a system. This is in line with what was shown this morning. You're paying into a system that comes with a certain level of energy use and energy costs. To lower that energy use either through energy efficiency or to the provision of solar electricity comes with an investment. That investment saves you effectively your money, reduces your bills. And if you can kind of like, if you can square away the energy bill reduction against the investment, use the energy bill reduction to underwrite the actual investment, you have a self-financing capitalization strategy, right? Where the savings match or exceed all costs. We have a contractual structure, architecture under the sustainable energy utility concept that allows you to do that, that allows you to have a guaranteed structure of where the savings will always match, or as we heard this morning, exceed the cost that you're saving, that the project comes with. So there's some additional barriers that this strategy addresses, right? So by looking at the savings over the lifetime of the project against the initial upfront investment, underwriting the initial upfront investment from the savings allows you to spread out that high upfront cost over the entire lifetime of the project. There's some additional detail where you could apply multiple technology options, group them together in a project to customize and have context-specific application of it for different customers. And then the guarantee reduces risk significantly for clients, for developers, for everyone involved. And you're basically trying to aggregate the supply and demand at a different scale, right? So that's kind of like the main goal. So the way we've been doing that is by applying this sustainable energy utility structure, architecture in different contexts. This morning you heard briefly about the Delaware Sustainable Energy Utility. If you remember the $110 million investment against $148 million in guaranteed savings. We've basically taken that idea and applied it in Pennsylvania, where we did a project, $15 million investment, $30 million in guaranteed savings, so 2-to-1 ratio of savings versus investment. We applied the same idea in California, and we were operating or advising the operation of the Seoul Solar City, where it's basically on the same principles, the same dimensions, the same mechanics. It's just now focusing explicitly on solar, whereas the Delaware Sustainable Energy Utility was more focused on energy efficiency. So this approach, this strategy has received some endorsement or recommendation from different organizations across the world. So as an example, the Asian Development Bank mentioned that it was useful for the Asian region to consider for energy efficiency aspects and for renewable energy development. The White House at the time supported the model, and the International Energy Agency in its 2016 Technology Perspectives publication had a section on the sustainable energy utility to discuss its benefits and its promise. So when you then go, so that's kind of like module 1 with a portion of module 2. So if you then have module 2, where you're kind of looking at the economics of solar, together with this level of uncertainty in the different variables, what we did for New York City is basically kind of model the benefit-cost ratio across a 10 gigawatt system. Obviously, if you would actually pursue installation, you would not start with 10 gigawatts. You would do something like Solvay, start with a gigawatt. But what we did, we modeled all these variables, and we found that in part because of the high electricity rate in New York City, in part because of the fairly generous policy support, both local, state, and federal policy support, you would be able to actually finance a project at scale with a benefit-cost ratio that becomes positive roughly about 9 years. So it would pay itself back in about a 9-year time period. If you want to be more certain that it does so, that this is the level of uncertainty around the estimate, you would extend it further in. Well, 9 to 12 years sounds perhaps like a long time. Infrastructure level investments typically, right? Like if you're considering building infrastructure like a bridge or any other kind of public project, those typically extend their debt lifetimes to a much longer period of time, about like 20, 25 years, right? So this is actually quite a reasonable finding for New York City to actually do it. So the basic structure, to repeat then, is that instead of operating at the market-based interaction in the bottom here, where you're trying to increase the slice of the pie that is agreeable to the market, you're kind of aggregating to a level where you go to the capital bond market, you aggregate the demand to the infrastructure scale, not just as individual tack-on projects, but you bundle them together to a large-scale project. And you develop a vehicle, which we were calling the Sustainable Energy Utility, that can actually manage the interaction and the mechanisms between large-scale capital and large-scale infrastructure. So what I thought I'd leave you with is just a kind of indication of what it could mean for city-level development. So what we did for Manhattan and the rest of the boroughs is calculate for a peak moment, right? So if you're talking about the peak summer moment, this is what we represent here is the all-time system peak for New York City, where they use the most electricity, which was in the summer of 2013 with a major heat wave. We've modeled the electricity production versus the consumption for 68 regions of the city. And what you basically see is that Manhattan is always, no matter how hot it is, really power hungry, right? Like we saw in the initial pictures, large amounts of consumption. But even at system peak, highest level moment of consumption, you find that the outer boroughs have sufficient amounts of space relative to their consumption to produce more electricity than they would consume. And that has some interesting relationships to energy, right? Yeah, this is the last slide, sorry. Yeah. So the final point then is that it creates kind of an interesting relationship to energy where in particular in New York City, the Bronx and Queens are relatively the socioeconomic status that are below Manhattan in terms of income and in terms of quality of living environments. So you could envision a scenario where the city of Manhattan, the borough of Manhattan, is a net off-taker, or at least in terms of moments of high energy consumption, is an off-taker of electricity from its surrounding boroughs, where you establish a financial flow from the rich, wealthy part of New York City to the surrounding areas to kind of generate a support for this type of strategy, right? So that's basically what I wanted to go over, and then I welcome any questions you would have later. Thank you.